Young and the Restless spoilers preview week of February 24th to 28th, 2025. Victor Newman had always prided himself on his ability to foresee every move in his vast empire. The business mogul's sharp instincts had kept him ahead of his rivals for decades, building his legacy as one of the most powerful men in Genoa City. But even Victor, with all his years of experience and manipulation, couldn't have predicted the storm brewing just beyond the horizon. The news had come to him in the form of a message from Michael Baldwin, his trusted ally and legal consultant. Michael had uncovered a troubling development. Damien, a figure who had quietly emerged in the shadows, was not who he appeared to be. His operations were far more complex than initially assumed, and his ties to the underworld stretched deeper than anyone in Genoa City could have imagined. Michael had informed Victor that Damien's empire was deeply rooted in Los Angeles, with a network of companies that formed a labyrinthine structure, one that was incredibly difficult to penetrate. Damien was no simple player in the game. His motives were unclear, and his connections reached beyond the reach of normal businessmen. The key to understanding Damien's intricate web, Michael had discovered, lay with one person, Aristotle Dumas. This name sent a chill down Victor's spine. Aristotle Dumas, someone whose identity remained an enigma. No one knew whether Dumas was a man or a woman, a figure cloaked in mystery with a power so vast that even Victor himself found it unnerving. Michael had spent weeks tracing the tenuous threads of Dumas's connections, but as of now, nothing was certain. What Victor did know was that Dumas was somehow the key to understanding Damien's true intentions. Michael, you need to focus. Find Dumas. No more delays. We need the truth, no matter what, Victor had commanded, his voice low and menacing. He was accustomed to manipulating people into following his lead, but with this situation, even Victor felt a flicker of uncertainty. With that, Michael Baldwin knew his next move was clear. He would leave Genoa City and track down Aristotle Dumas. It was a mission he couldn't back out of, but it was one that would come with serious consequences. Victor had underestimated how much this decision would ripple through the lives of those around him. Michael's departure was met with shock, especially from Lauren Baldwin, his wife. Lauren, who had grown accustomed to the stability that Michael provided, now found herself in the position of dealing with her husband's absence. Her concern for him had always been palpable, but this time it was different. The stakes were higher, and her anger simmered beneath the surface. Lauren had always been a woman of strength, a woman who had endured many challenges in her life. But Michael's sudden departure, the way he'd been swept up in Victor's web without a second thought, left her feeling betrayed. She had supported him through everything, even the darkest times, but now, with the promise of him leaving to chase a ghost named Aristotle Dumas, Lauren couldn't suppress her frustrations any longer. "What are you doing, Michael? Why are you so willing to follow Victor into this madness?" she had demanded, her voice thick with emotion. The uncertainty gnawed at her, and deep down, she knew that there was no way she could stand by while Michael risked everything for someone like Victor. Michael, torn between his loyalty to Victor and his love for Lauren, had no answers for her. His departure seemed inevitable. Yet, in his heart, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a storm that would change everything, not just for him, but for his marriage as well. As Michael prepared to leave Genoa City, he was unaware of the storm that was brewing in the personal life of another resident, Audra. The stunning woman who had become entangled in the lives of both Nate Hastings and Holden had a secret she'd been holding on to for far too long. And now, with everything in her life beginning to unravel, it was time for the truth to surface. Audra had once been in a relationship with Holden, a connection that was complicated and deeply emotional. Their time together had been filled with passion, but also intense disagreements. The two of them, despite their connection, had found themselves at an impasse, a place where their ideals no longer aligned, and so they parted ways. Now, with Holden still lingering in the background of her life, Audra found herself in a difficult position. She could no longer deny that there were still feelings between them. She could see it in Holden's eyes, the way he looked at her with a longing that hadn't fully disappeared. But Audra had made her decision. She had chosen to walk away from the past and build a future free from the complications that Holden brought into her life. She had a life to live, and it wasn't one filled with regret. "I can't go back, Holden. It's over," Audra confessed, her voice resolute. "I want peace. I want a future that's mine and mine alone. I can't let the past drag me back down again." Holden, however, wasn't as easily deterred. Despite his feelings for Audra, despite the pull he still felt toward her, he couldn't deny the fact that they had changed, that the relationship they once shared could never be the same again. And so, He stepped back, giving her the space she needed, even as his heart ached. In the midst of all this turmoil, Nate Hastings found himself at a crossroads. His relationship with Audra had been one of the few stable aspects of his life, and he was determined to protect her at all costs. Nate had become fiercely protective of Audra, a man who had finally found someone who made him feel complete. But the situation with Holden was a problem Nate couldn't ignore. He could sense the tension between Audra and Holden, and despite Audra's assurances that she was done with her ex, Nate couldn't help but wonder if there was still something unresolved. Would she be able to stay faithful to him? Or would the pull of her past with Holden be too strong to overcome? Nate knew that Audra needed space, but he also knew that he couldn't allow Holden to re-enter her life without a fight. The thought of losing Audra, of her turning back to Holden, terrified him. He had already been through too much in his life to let go of something that made him truly happy. As Nate pondered his next steps, the question lingered: would Audra remain faithful to him, or would the ghosts of her past haunt their future? And could he truly protect her from the forces that seemed determined to pull her in different directions? Victor's web of deception and power was growing ever more complicated, and with each new revelation it became clearer that the stakes had never been higher. As Michael pursued Aristotle Dumas, and as the lives of those around him began to unravel, it seemed as though no one in Genoa City could escape the storm that was coming for them all. In the end, the question was no longer just about business empires and hidden identities. It was about trust, loyalty, and the fragile nature of love. Would Victor's empire crumble, or would it survive the storm? And in the midst of it all, would Audra and Nate find their way back to each other, or would the forces of the past tear them apart forever? Only time would tell, as Genoa City prepared for the next chapter in its long, twisted tale of power, betrayal, and love. Phyllis wakes up in a nightmarish situation, a twisted web of kidnapping and betrayal. Phyllis Summers' mind raced as she jolted awake in a cold, unfamiliar space. Her heart pounded and panic swept over her, leaving her breathless. She instinctively tried to move but realized her body was constricted, bound by something tight. A sense of horror clung to her as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. The dim light and barren walls gave no comfort, and the eerie silence that surrounded her only made her more anxious. Where was she? Why was she here? The events leading up to this moment were a blur. She remembered nothing but fragments, fleeting images of the people she trusted, faces that she believed had her back. But now, in this sterile, isolated room, all she could feel was terror. Who had done this to her? What had she done to deserve this? As the fog of confusion began to clear, Phyllis struggled to recall her recent interactions. Who had she crossed? Was there anyone in her life who would go to such lengths to hurt her? Her thoughts swirled, and the panic in her chest only intensified. The last thing she could remember was being in her apartment. Then, nothing. It was as though someone had erased her life in a heartbeat. But why? Who had orchestrated this twisted plan? Her hands trembled as she reached for the cold stone wall beside her. Her voice cracked as she whispered, Who did this to me?" Suddenly, a faint sound echoed through the walls. A cry for help. Phyllis's heart skipped a beat. Was someone else here? She strained her ears, trying to discern where the sound had come from. The desperate cry rang out again, and her instincts kicked in. She pressed her ear to the wall, and through the thin barrier, she heard a familiar voice. A voice she never thought she would hear in this context. It was Sharon Newman. "Sharon," Phyllis whispered, her mind racing. She called out through the wall, "Sharon, are you there? What's happening?" Another muffled cry, followed by a weak, hoarse response, confirmed Phyllis's worst fear. Sharon was here too, a victim of the same sinister plot that had ensnared Phyllis. Why had they both been taken? What did this mean? And how had they been caught in this tangled web of conspiracy and betrayal? Phyllis's mind raced with questions, but no answers came. She struggled against her restraints, but the tightness of the ropes only added to her frustration. Why Sharon? Why had she been pulled into this horrific situation? Was there something Sharon knew, something that made her a target? Or was this purely a random act of cruelty? Meanwhile, in Genoa City, life continued, though it felt as if it were drifting further from Phyllis's reach. Summer Newman, her daughter, was in the midst of making monumental decisions about her life, decisions that would affect not only her future but also that of her son, Harrison. Summer and her husband, Kyle Abbott, had decided it was time to settle into a new chapter of their lives, one filled with the promise of stability and family. Harrison was ready to begin school, a sign of a fresh start for the little boy, but also a bitter reminder that Claire, his biological mother, had been pushed aside. Summer, as Harrison's legal mother, had the final say, and she had made it clear to Kyle that Claire would not be part of their son's life, at least for now. The decision weighed heavily on her heart. She loved Harrison with all of her being, but the complicated history with Claire had made it impossible for them to coexist. Summer didn't want to keep Harrison from his biological mother, but she couldn't ignore the damage Claire had done to their family. As Kyle and Summer discussed their future and how to navigate their roles as parents, they couldn't help but feel a sense of dread hanging in the air. Everything was changing so rapidly, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead cast a shadow over their happiness. Would Claire fight for her place in Harrison's life? Would Summer's decision cause irreparable damage? But for Summer, the decision had already been made. She had Harrison's well-being to think about, and no matter what came next, she had to be strong for him. No matter how much the situation with Claire hurt, she couldn't let her son bear the consequences of a broken family. For now, it was her and Kyle and Harrison against the world. However, in the darkness, Phyllis's fate hung in the balance. The tension between the two stories, Phyllis's abduction and Summer's attempts to create a stable life for Harrison, mirrored the uncertainty in both women's lives. Phyllis had no idea that her daughter was struggling with a major decision, nor did she know that her own fate would become a pivotal part of a much larger game. As Phyllis continued to fight against her restraints, she wondered how far the people behind this nightmare would go. Who else was involved? What other secrets would be uncovered? And most chilling of all, was this truly about her, or was she merely a pawn in someone else's twisted game? Her heart sank as another thought crossed her mind. What if Sharon wasn't the only other person involved? What if there were more people to worry about? More enemies lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike? In the chaos that was unfolding, Phyllis knew one thing for certain: she needed to escape. The answers she sought were buried in this nightmare, but she would not rest until she uncovered them all. Whether it was Claire's struggle for Harrison's future or Sharon's cryptic involvement in her abduction, Phyllis would fight for herself, for her daughter, and for the truth. And as the hours dragged on in that dark, suffocating place, one thing became clear: the twisted tale was far from over.